Welcome everyone who's joining. We'll get started in just one more minute here. We're just waiting for people to join. Appreciate you taking the time today on this sunny Wednesday in the Northern Hemisphere. All right, I think we'll get started for today. Again, thanks everybody for joining. This is a lot of fun. For me, this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. My name is Jason, and I'm joining you here from Kanini. And when I was a practitioner at a large financial services company, I actually played a role where I got to connect the enterprise and speak to different areas that really didn't understand each other's business and play a role. And I had a voice at the table for understanding what is our risk register and what is our risk appetite and how do we actually bring that to life with the people in different roles throughout the organization. So I'm very happy to be here today with you, and I'm actually absolutely thrilled to bring you another fellow Milwaukeean, Michael Rasmussen, our special guest here to talk about GRC and how can we rethink risk across our enterprise. So I'll pass it over to Michael to introduce himself, and a warm welcome to Michael Rasmussen.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Michael Rasmussen, and my day job, I'm an analyst. My job is research. I spend my time understanding and researching what are the challenges companies face: governance, risk management, and compliance, what we call GRC. But you might call it ERM, ORM, IRM, ABC, XYZ, or not even have an acronym for it. But I spend my days understanding what are the challenges organizations face in context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how do they go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. So my job is research. I spent 7 years at Forrester, and now, 15 years of my own, and had nearly a decade before Forrester. But that's what I'm about.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for that introduction. I think one of the core outputs of this research are you get these insights that you didn't necessarily have before you connect all the dots. And that's what we're talking about today, are how do we get those insights? And, it's been a rough couple of years. We've all been through a lot. And I know that risk is on the top of our minds right now as we transition to this next chapter. And those of you that know me, I absolutely love changes in season. And here again in Wisconsin, where I'm from, it's about springtime. It's warmer weather, birds are chirping. It's kind of a positive change. And I remember not that long ago where, we were transitioning into colder weather and even snow. Change is inevitable, and we're going to have changes in our environment. And those changes are either going to be things that we expect and anticipate, or things that catch us by surprise. And when those changes catch us by surprise, it inherently introduces risk. So what can we do proactively to, number one, become more aware and connect those dots, as Michael does every day as a research analyst, in order to make smarter decisions and kind of position ourselves to learn from the environment around us and even learn from things that we've been through in the past. So today, it's very timely to take the opportunity today to focus on risk management and kind of frame up what can we do and how can we get smarter about the way that we approach risk in our environment. So for today, there's really three areas that we're going to focus on. First, I want to talk about the 3 lines model and how does it apply to connecting the enterprise. That's the core mission here. We want to move closer to a unified front when we're talking about risk management, and move together as one unified, intelligent organization. We'll talk about what that looks like in the organization. So what does it mean when you're interconnected in terms of your risk management? And kind of a newer concept where it's not just either or. It's not just left brain thinking, very analytical, very fact-driven, or it's not just right brain either, where it's creative and thinking outside the box. What can we do when we put both of those methodologies together and ultimately improve our position to manage the risk in our environment? And we're going to have some time at the end for some Q&A. I hope that you, throughout this webinar, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box if something pops up. And we're interested in kind of focusing on learning from each other, as well as capitalizing on this time where we're going to take away some things that'll help us become more unified in our operation. So first thing we want to talk about here is this 3 lines model. And I'm curious, I think we have a poll on the screen in a moment. Have you heard of this before? And really, what's your level of familiarity and what does it mean to you? So kind of pick where you're at in your environment.
Now, for perspective, it's called the 3 lines model today, but a lot of us know it from previously being called the 3 lines of defense model. The Institute of Internal Auditors a couple of years ago changed it and dropped the of defense because they realized it was just more than just a defensive posture. And so it's just now called the 3 lines model. But as you're answering this poll, you might understand it, remember it for those that have a history in the space as the 3 lines of defense.
Yeah, that's a great point. So a couple more moments here on this poll question, and then we'll show the results. I'm really interested to see the audience that we have on this webinar and see how familiar you are with this model, because ultimately we want to connect all 3 of the different lines together. And again, it's about feedback loops and it's about communication and tracking in a central way. All right, very good. So we have 11% of the folks live and breathe this. It's every day. It's your bread and butter. That's awesome that we have some experts joining us. And then we have a mix between people that are either starting out at the very beginning, learning about this model, and people that are quite familiar. So that's fantastic. Thank you for that poll. I would just wanted to illustrate, I have a slide here from that IIA governing body for the international auditors. And if you think about it, the people on the front lines are the ones who are focusing on your customers, and they kind of have their ear to the street, if you think about it that way. And then we have kind of a level of governance and expertise, people that are closer in the management layer as the second line. And then the third line is really maybe a step away. They're the ones creating the policies and the objectives, people creating the strategy for your organization. And the goal here, of course, is to kind of connect all of them. But the question I have is, what can we do? Number one, how can we detect? And number two, how can we take action and take some steps towards integrating when one of these lines is kind of deficient or not optimized?
Yeah, and in the past, there's been a lot of focus on the second and third line roles. And that's something to understand is that, the second line, or the third line role is audit and assurance, and being able to do internal audits and things like that. Second line roles typically are the back office functions of risk, compliance, security. And so historically, a lot of programs have been focused from the second to third line. But what's happening now, particularly this interconnected risk environment, is that risk is taken and managed and owned at the front line, the first line, from operational management down to even the frontline employee. The teller at the bank is making risk decisions every day on customer privacy to money laundering and cash handling and fraud. The doctor, nurse at the hospital are making decisions every day. And so what we're seeing that there's a lot of focus on shifting, a lot of the risk management and accountability from the second line roles to the first line. And the second line role is becoming much more of a facilitator of risk and compliance management, but there's much more engagement at the first line.
Yeah, that's true. And I like how you break it down into those tangible examples, Michael, especially with the healthcare. The people, the nurses, the MAs, the doctors, they're the ones who actually understand this stuff, but sometimes they're too busy to move on to the next patient or the next case. Is there a place for them to document and kind of review and digest what has happened when they notice something in the environment?
And I say most definitely.
Yeah, reflection is key, right? I think that's one of the secrets of some of the most successful people is they pause and reflect and capture this stuff at some regular interval. So we have another poll question to pop up here on the 3 lines model. So let's put that on the screen in a moment here. So which one do you think needs the most attention? Is it that front line in your organization? Is it the second? Is it the third? What is your experience? I'm curious where this audience stands in this poll question.
I definitely have my opinion, but I'll wait and not influence people.
That's right. Yes. I'm absolutely biased also from my experience and from what I've seen. I've seen some room for improvement across all 3, but there's definitely one that stands out to me. And again, my mission is just how can we connect? How can we, whether it's bringing people together around food or something like that, always works for me. How can we improve communication and also build some kind of a centralized process where we communicate and connect across the organization? All right, so let's look at the results of this poll. Which one do you think needs the most attention? Front line, second line, or third line? And overwhelmingly, front line. That's what we expected, right? 57% of folks here believe that the front line needs the most attention, followed by the second line and then the third line.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And if you unpack that second line, I would think that you'd find that it needs attention because it needs to be able to facilitate with the first line more.
So it's like inviting people to the table and giving them a voice. There was a customer experience campaign slightly away from the GRC topic where we gave the people on the front lines just a low tech, like a button, like a USB button that they push every time that they detected, I think it was around compliments, so customer was very happy. We wanted to measure positive sentiment in the environment. So customer was happy, push a button. And then you kind of just collect all that data on a web portal. And now you give the people a voice and you have an opportunity to collect and look at the data. So it's all about unifying. It's all about measuring intangible things and what can we do to make this better decisions. All right, very good. So that's the first area that we wanted to cover, just kind of introduce the vocabulary. Next, we're going to talk about some of the strategy to connect that environment. And for me, it's really about how can we understand what is the spectrum of how connected we are, and so place us on that spectrum somewhere. Maybe we're starting out kind of on the left, or maybe we're somewhere in the middle, or maybe we do have some really good lines of communication and we're making decisions based on kind of, again, that unified front. And what's one step that we could take to make it better? So that's what I'm kind of interested in this section. And I know that Michael has an amazing perspective on this topic. It's also near and dear to your heart. So I'll turn it back over to Michael here and walk us through what can we do to become more aware, and then also what are some things that we could do to make it better?
Certainly. Wow. Where do we even start? I mean, first off, if we go back to 2019, before the pandemic, I wrote 2 blog articles that are out on my website towards the end of 2019. One was in October, one was in December. And so this is before the pandemic, just a few months before. The first one was called Navigating Chaos. And it was an article I published in Enterprise Risk Magazine by the Institute of Risk Management in London. I'm a global ambassador of risk management, honorary life member for the Institute of Risk Management in London. And so the book was the article was called Navigating Chaos, and how today's modern business environment has an interconnected risk environment. That modern business has this interrelationships, just as like the previous slide, the interconnectedness of risk. And I referenced the quote from the physicist Fritjof Capra. The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are interdependent and interconnected. And he was talking about biological ecosystems. We might as well been talking about business today, because it is an interconnected risk environment. Regulations are changing, risks are changing, geopolitical risks are changing, the business itself is changing, and we have to keep up with all this change. The other blog article I wrote was in December of 2019 that was called A Tale of Two Futures. Is our future a Blade Runner future or a Star Trek future? That the decisions that governments, but also individuals and also corporations make today are going to influence whether we're headed towards that dystopia Blade Runner or that positive environment of like Star Trek, where, I mean, I'm just watching the second season of Picard, and you look at San Francisco and things, and in the future, and it's a very green as well as a very socially friendly and engaging space. Obviously, there's conflicts, it's a story, but there's an intergalactic cooperation of races and things. And so there's a much positive future with Star Trek than you have with Blade Runner. And I point out in that article that the decisions corporations make, it needs to be reflected in their enterprise risk strategies right now. That if you look at a lot of risk management programs, you'd think our only risk is IT security risk, which is a huge risk. But I even mentioned that a lot of enterprise risk programs fail to look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, and the top risks that the world faces are pandemic risks and environmental risks like climate change. And then a couple months later comes COVID-19 to prove my point in the article. An interconnected risk environment. What starts off with the health and safety risk cascades into IT security risk in the work from home environment, increased risk of fraud, conduct risks, as people are on Zoom meetings and team meetings, and they're saying things on corporate meetings because they're in their home office and they're wearing their pajama pants underneath the desk. They're saying things that would never be allowed in a corporate conference room, crossing the lines of harassment and discrimination. Increased risk of modern slavery and things, because factories go dark and they reopen because of the pandemic with child labor and forced labor. It's an interconnected risk environment, and we need to be able to see that. So, I mean, if you look at the slide here, organizations have focused in the last couple of years a lot on resiliency. Resiliency is extremely important. We need to be resilient organizations. A resilient organization is one that has the capacity to recover quickly from events. The ability of an organization to spring back into shape. It's that recovery from events. So we have a lot of resiliency type regulations. You got in the United Kingdom, you've got the Bank of England, the FCA, PRA Operational Resilience Guidance. You've got the EU's DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act. You've got the Basel and Bank for National Settlements Operational Resilience Guidance. And here in the United States, you got the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Operational Resilience Guidance. And so resilience is extremely important. But that's the ability to recover. I'm back 2 slides. I'm sort of framing this. But we need to be more than resilient. We also need to be agile. Agility is the ability to move quickly and easily, the ability to think and understand quickly, to see our environment. And today's organizations not only need to be resilient, they also need to be agile. And these two go hand in hand. In fact, if you look at the United Kingdom's operational resilience regulations definition, I like it the most because it actually is the only definition for resilience regulations that goes beyond resilience to talk about agility. Because all the others like the USOCC and DORA and all these, they talk about the ability to recover from an event, the resilient angle. It's the United Kingdom's definition that actually talks about the ability to prevent or avoid an event, that sense of agility. So on the next slide is we need to look at agility, not just resiliency. Agility is the ability to navigate and leverage our environment. Like the gentleman here on the slide, if you look at those YouTube videos of parkour, you get people that actually use the environment for their advantage. So if I'm running down the street and I see some type of obstacle, how can I use that obstacle and leverage that obstacle? That's the idea of agility. Or if it's a hazard, to avoid that obstacle. While resilience on the next slide is that idea to recover from an event. So if I'm running and I see that curb or pothole and I trip over it, how quickly can I get up and start running again? That's the idea of resilience, is that ability to recover. While agility is the flip of that. I see that curb or pothole and I jump over it and it doesn't trip me. And today's organizations need to be agile as well as resilient, both together. And not just because of the pandemic, but because of everything around us. You look at the geopolitical situation and the tensions in Ukraine and Europe. This is becoming so critically important to be both agile and resilient together.
Michael, this picture kind of triggers me. It reminds me of my track days where I had to run on a sprained ankle. So I could appreciate the note of being resilient. And I think it actually makes an impact on your culture, on the company culture. Where are we agile? Are we resilient? And how could we check? And what could we do to become more agile and resilient in our culture?
That is certainly correct. So if we bring this together, what we need to do is take a top-down approach that looks at business agility and risk. That's risk aligned to objectives, as well as operational resilience and risk. When we talk about rethinking risk, I cut my teeth in my career in IT security back in the 90s. And so risk is a hazard, and you come to the point that we have to eliminate risk, which is not feasible. But we were thinking about the downside of risk, but really risk is also a tool. Teddy Roosevelt, the US president, stated, "Risk is like fire. If controlled, it will help you. If uncontrolled, it will rise up and destroy you." Risk used properly is the tool. When we're talking about rethinking risk, how can we use risk to our advantage? John Paul Jones, he's a famous Revolutionary War naval hero going back, 250 years ago. We all know him for his famous statement, "I have not yet begun to fight," when he was losing a battle against a larger British frigate, that he turned around and won that battle. But he also stated, "It is the law of nature, inflexible and inexorable, that those who do not risk do not win." Risk is part of war. Risk is part of business. Risk is part of life. We take risks every day. And about investments, you sit down with your financial advisor and They ask you questions on, what your goals are and where you're at in life. And that triggers, how much risk you take in your investments, because you want greater gain, but that greater gain might mean there's greater potential for loss as well. So they profile you for your risk. Risk is a tool for business. And so we need that business agility. Judge Mervyn Keene of the infamous Keene 1, 2, 3, and now 4 reports on corporate governance down in South Africa. He stated, enterprise, the undertaking of risk for reward. Translating from British Commonwealth or Queen's English to US English, businesses take risks to make money. Risk is a tool if used properly. And we have to take the right risks and make sure we're not taking the wrong risks. And so we need this top-down approach that understands risk in context of objectives. And if you look at ISO 31000, the international standard on risk management, it says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So there's a relationship there. We have our objectives. They can be strategic entity level objectives. They can be division level objectives, department, process, project, or even asset level objectives like personal information, like EU citizen information regulated by GDPR or whatever it might be. We have objectives from the information that we collect in the organization to the top level entity level objectives. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on those objectives by the ISO International Standard on Risk Management. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. We have to understand our objectives to be able to do a risk assessment in. And we need this top-down approach that understands our objectives and the risk to achieving those objectives. We also need this bottom-up approach down in the weeds, understanding what risk is out there in the operations and processes of the organization, and how do we address that. That means that we need to bring a lot together for risk management collaboration. Because the challenge is that on the next slide, a lot of organizations remind me of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. This is a sprawling mansion that was built in the 1800s. It cost $5.5 million to build then. You calculate inflation, that's one expensive house today. It took 38 years to build, had 147 different builders, but had no design, no blueprint, no architect. Today, it's got staircases that go up or down to nowhere, doors that open to walls or 20-foot drops. It had no design, no blueprint, no architect. This is a lot of organizations' risk management program that over the last 38 years, they've had 147 different builders of risk in their little silos with no overall design or blueprint for how risk management should work and function in the organization. You've got IT risk and HR risk and accounting risk and environmental risk and health and safety risk. Everybody has their little silos, but they fail to see the big picture and to be able to connect all this to see the interconnectedness of risk. We need to rethink risk. That means a top-down approach, where we collectively work together on the next slide, thinking about risk management strategy. What are the different departments of risk? You might have a chief risk officer, but I've never met a chief risk officer that's really responsible for all of risk. Because you've got HR risk, you've got accounting related risks, you got IT risks, you got environmental risks and health and safety risks and quality risks. Every area's got a risk. And so we need to be able to herd the cats and collectively have a cohesive risk management strategy, understand our risk management processes to identify risk, assess risk, address risk. How do we manage risk in context of the objectives and performance of the organization? And it needs to be supported by a cohesive information technology architecture that provides contextual insight. I was talking to one firm that was spending 200 employee hours to build a risk management report for the board of directors, because they had to go and comb through all the documents, spreadsheets, and emails. That was their information technology architecture, was documents, spreadsheets, and emails. It took them 200 hours to build a risk report annually for the board of directors to find out that they had risk issues that started 9 months ago. That's not managing risk. That's reacting to risk at that point. You need information technology that can give you situational awareness of risk when and where you need it. That's important. So some of the things you need to ask yourself, some of the drivers, what are the strategic, business, and regulatory drivers for risk management in your organization? What are the top risks and emerging risks facing your organization? What risks could derail business strategy? What are some of the process improvements? What is the process to manage risk today, your current state? What kinds of improvements are required or being contemplated? What distinctive competence can be gained by optimizing risk management in your organization? How will a risk management program help the organization improve performance? How will it gain visibility across the business and IT? And then looking at the governance team and collaboration. Who sponsors the risk management program? Who owns it? How are people engaged to collaboratively work on risk management? What needs to change culturally and organizationally? What kind of skill sets are needed? Who needs to be involved? And what do you expect to get out of the program? But a key thing is accountability. And to me, there's a difference between responsibility and accountability. And responsibility is about tasks. I can outsource tasks. I can take responsibilities or tasks and give them to somebody else to do. Accountability is the buck stops here. I own this. I'm accountable. In some areas of the world, like the United Kingdom with their senior managers and certification regime, Ireland with SEER, the senior executive accountability regime, Hong Kong with their managers in charge regime, Singapore with their individual accountability and conduct regime, Australia with their BEAR, now FEAR regulation, financial executive accountability regime. That's the best name for regulation I've ever seen, is the FEAR regulation. These are all regimes that are putting accountability for risk. Like in the United Kingdom, you have 28 senior management functions that have different risk responsibilities, or I should say accountabilities. And that if there is some type of willful misconduct, that senior management function can go to jail. If there's negligence or lack of due diligence in a risk area, like environmental risk or money laundering risk and things like that, that senior management function can be personally fined out of their bank account, not the bank's bank account. We need risk accountability, that people actually own risk and not just pass it around like a hot potato.
Michael, I think the previous slide that you showed that has a list of questions that you could ask your leadership team. This reminds me of the first time that this large financial services organization failed an audit, and we had a decree. First of all, there were fines associated, and like you said, nobody went to jail, thankfully, but there were definitely some financial penalties, and we guaranteed that we were not going to put ourselves in a position to fail an audit again. So that's where those early days, we had senior management, executive sponsorship that was accountable, and they could not handle it by themselves. It's a team effort. We need to connect all three areas, like you mentioned, the 3 lines model earlier. Get everyone working on the same page, moving in the same direction, beating the same drum. And that's where we implemented things like that risk register, a regular biweekly conversation about what risks are on the register and what's new, what's changed. And now that we've learned the things over the last two weeks in our environment, are there any changes? Do we make investments where in the past the answer was not yet? Maybe now something has kind of risen in the prioritization exercise we do. And we need to actually argue for an investment now, because otherwise the penalties are going to be far worse.
That is so true. And what's really interesting here is that we need frontline engagement, because at the end of the day, it's the front office that's taking risk every day. I mean, the coal miner in the coal mine is making environmental and health and safety risk decisions every moment of the day. The doctor or nurse at a hospital are making patient safety and patient privacy decisions every moment of every day. We need engagement on risk management, not just in the back office, but in the front office. In fact, I was working with a large insurance firm, a global insurance firm, and they're looking at technology in the space. And in their RFP, their big thing is yes, we need all the advanced complexity of risk modeling and analytics for the back office functions. But what we need even more than that is streamlined, intuitive interfaces on risk to engage the front office. That becomes critical.
Yeah, it's that single system of action and record, right? It's do we have a platform that brings it all together and doesn't just kind of throw it over the wall? That's not a good way to engage all 3 lines.
And then we need to figure out how to operationalize risk. And this is really important when we look in the next slide here, that, how do we understand risk in a business context point of view? I get really frustrated because I cut my teeth in the risk world in IT security in the 90s. And a lot of times we look at vulnerabilities and things like on systems, but we fail to put it into a business context. If we're going to really communicate and get the frontline as well as executive management engaged on risk management, we have to let them know, how does this risk impact business operations? How does this risk impact business performance? You have to contextualize and help people understand what that risk really means to the organization, because that is absolutely critical for engaging people on risk management, is putting it in context. And what does it mean to the business? How is it going to impact the business? And so to me, that's a lot more than a high, medium, low on a heat map or something like that. There's a lot more narrative that has to go into place there. It also means that we have to be able to quantify risk and risk exposure and be able to help people understand what is the potential impact for that. And the interesting thing about quantitative risk analysis is it's not just one point in time. When you look at a risk from the people that understand risk and do risk every day, risk is a distribution. There's different scenarios where this risk might materialize. And each scenario has a different level of impact in things. And it can almost, it sort of looks like a bell curve of where that greatest impact and exposure is to the organization. Because risk isn't just like plotting things again, like in a heat map on this little point. Good risk management is about scenarios and how those scenarios play out. And there's scenarios where that risk has greater exposure, and there's scenarios where that risk has less exposure. And where is that risk at the greatest concentration and most likely to impact the organization? And how are we going to address that?
And I love our opportunity to kind of check ourselves and measure our quality. Now that it's almost spring in the Northern Hemisphere, the risk of it snowing and creating a dangerous travel situation is decreasing over time, right? And I think our goal internally is to kind of beat the weatherman at our predictions. So I think I love that bell curve that you mentioned. It's all about putting the data in front of us so we could all see and ask questions of the data and gather insights before we create those decisions. So I think that brings us to our third topic, which I love the whole beat the weatherman. I think some of the news channels around here, they brag about having the most accurate news forecast when it comes to the weather. And I think they're right. We all have kind of our opinions of which other weather apps or which weather messages are garbage and which ones tend to be more accurate. I think that's what we have to do to ensure that the data that we're getting is quality and that we're making the right decisions. And that's a bit of an art form. That's not only a science or a math test. We're incorporating other elements here. And the holy grail here is to get that whole brain thinking. So I want to learn more here about what is the left versus right brain and how can we bring it all together?
Well, left brain thinking is traditional risk thinking that we've had on the next slide. But that's the logical and structured thinking about risk in the organization. It's about our risk models and in scenarios and seeing how those play out. Whether it's Monte Carlo analysis, Bayesian modeling, or whatever risk assessment technique you're using. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data, and sensibly one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." It's logical and structured. We build our risk models, but you know what the problem with the model is? A model is limited. It doesn't accurately represent the real world perfectly. It has to, within a degree, represent the real world, but the real world has so many variables. It's so complex and intricate that any type of risk model never accurately represents the real world. And we need good models, and we need left brain thinking on risk, but what's also needed today is right brain, creative and imaginative thinking about risk management. Alvin Toffler stated, "You can use all the quantitative data you can get, but you still have to distrust it and use your own intelligence and judgment." I'm saying both are correct, Alvin Toffler and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, that we need left brain and right brain thinking. If left brain thinking is the ability to think inside the box being a model, right brain thinking is the ability to think outside of the box. What's wrong with this model? What is this model not telling us? Where can this model be tweaked or improved? And the good risk management is going to bring together both left brain and right brain thinking. My frustration is I think that a lot of risk management historically has been stuck with the left brain, and we failed to really engage right brain thinkers in on risk management, which is so needed today in today's complex navigating chaos business environment. But what's also
Michael,
important is, yeah, go on.
I used to call that the contrarian view. Do we have any contrarians on board? A famous quote, I don't know who said it. The people who invented the airplane are just as important as the people who invented the parachute, or maybe the other way around, right? The people who invented the parachute are equally as important as the people who invented the airplane, because we need to understand, what could go wrong and what can we do to make sure that we minimize the likelihood of a catastrophic situation when it does.
Good point. Which also brings us to risk culture. Do you understand accurately what is acceptable and unacceptable risk in your environment? There could be a point of insufficient risk taking where things aren't green on your risk registers because you don't take enough risk. I mean, if you live in a bubble, you're not going to be a very competitive organization. To be competitive, like Judge Mervyn Keene said, enterprise is the undertaking of risk for reward. We take risks to make money. There's a certain point where businesses might not be taking enough risk. One of my favorite articles I read on this was called Goldman Sachs Behind the Brass Plate. It was about 15 years ago in The Economist magazine. And there's a lot to that article, but one of the things that it contrasted Goldman Sachs to Lehman Brothers, and how Goldman Sachs takes on a lot more risk. They leverage and use risk to their advantage, while Lehman Brothers was more conservative in taking risk, but they didn't get the returns Goldman Sachs did because they didn't have sufficient risk taking there. They had insufficient risk taking. But it also talked about Goldman Sachs' risk culture, that Goldman Sachs developed a culture of risk where we aggressively take risk. We take the right risk. And part of that risk culture is making sure that people, that risk, if there's a significant material risk, it was a team effort, that people weren't making risk decisions as a Cavalier Lone Ranger type, that it was a significant risk decision, others were involved in making that decision. And it helped to get different perspectives and think inside the box and outside the box, as we were just talking about. We really need to clearly understand what our risk appetite is, what's acceptable and unacceptable risk, and what those risk tolerance and capacities are, but how that goes back to impact our risk culture. Well, how do we define our organization? Are we an organization that's very wary, where we avoid risk, or we are very adventurous with a high tolerance for risk taking? There's some great resources out here with the Institute of Risk Management in London that I'm part of on risk culture resources for practitioners that talks about modeling your organization, what type of, what's your risk culture and your risk behaviors, and how that all impacts your organization, like the ABC model, the attitudes, behavior, culture. The attitudes of the individuals in your organization shape the behavior in the organization, which shapes the culture. And that culture has a symbiotic relationship of further influencing the attitudes and behavior. We need to clearly understand what our risk culture is and how we can foster and nurture that in the right direction. Next to that, we also need to be able to clearly understand the information architecture that gives us insights. This is what's so important out here right now, is that we need technology and information architecture that can provide us contextual information on risk when and where we need it. Contextual intelligence, 360-degree contextual intelligence, or more, I like to also characterize it as James Bond situational awareness, to be able to understand what's going on in the relationships out there so we can understand risk to the organizational structure, controls, issues, policies, and so forth. It also means, in the context of the next slide, being able to take in different data points from different perspectives, and be able to integrate, map these together, understand these perspectives, analyze and understand relationships, and build out action items on how we can address this risk in the environment. All this becomes absolutely critically important to have situational awareness on risk. One firm I was working on their RFP, a mid-sized bank, found out that 80% of their risk management resources was nothing more than document reconcilers. 80% of their staff time is trying to manage documents and not manage risk. Now, the right information technology architecture is going to flip that around. I mentioned that other firm that was spending 200 hours to build a risk report for the board of directors. It's now available at a press of a button to get that report. But before, 200 hours once a year to build this report, going through all these documents, spreadsheets, and emails, that's not managing risk, that's reacting to risk. We need good insight and awareness into risk when and where the business needs it. One of my favorite approaches to risk management was with Brad Jewett. He's now the CFO at Corel Corporation, but before that, years ago, he was the enterprise risk manager at Microsoft. And he had this whole approach called the rhythm of risk. And what he did with that was he spent time understanding what is on the board and executive calendars. What are they discussing? Each different area of management, what are their objectives? What are they trying to achieve? And he would make sure that they had contextually relevant risk information aligned to their objectives and aligned to the agenda on their calendars, to provide context there. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, that just reminds me of, again, the impact of the culture. We got to make a habit out of meeting and looking at the data that's available to us. And I love how you mentioned a few times now, is all this stuff available to us in a single tool? And are we looking at the data in that tool? And oftentimes I see as a starting point, it's in multiple tools or maybe no tool at all. Maybe it's spreadsheets and Post-it notes. And different people have different perspectives that are just kind of siloed, like we talked about. So there's a big opportunity to bring it all together And I think the key is to start where you're at. If we have a manual process or not much of a process at all today, that's okay. But what are the risks? What does that risk register look like? Those questions that you showed earlier, what are some of the answers, and kind of create some thought-provoking ideas on what are some things that we could do to get started if that's you, where you don't have a process. If you do have a process, how can we integrate it and just build those lines of communication and feedback loops and meet regularly? I think, every other week is a good minimum if you are kind of in recovery mode or emergency response mode, where you find yourself, failing an audit like we did. But if you're in a good position and you just want to become more proactive, it starts with establishing those standard habits and rallying around a single strategy for technology. And basically data analytics is what it comes down to.
It certainly does. And a lot of it also is some of the culture, not just the technology, but technology can enable this, but the culture we do scenario analysis and risk assessment within. Because the problem is that if we're going to do like some type of tabletop exercise in scenarios, we're going to get a bunch of people in a room, and there's some executive that has a lot of power and authority, and they speak their mind. You have the risk that everybody else in the room says, oh, yes, I agree with that person. And nobody's really stepping up and speaking what they really think. And that could be a risk in itself in a risk assessment, in a risk scenario analysis. And so we need to make sure there's creative ways for people to be heard. And so like present the scenario and then get people to like submit their ideas and thoughts on the risk anonymously, and then go around and read them and get different perspectives on that. Because too often, sometimes risk management can be held hostage by some very strong, charismatic figure. And there's other people that have very valid insights into the risk, but they're scared to speak up or just too shy.
Yeah, that's a great example of the right brain thinking that we went through earlier. And I think that's one of the most difficult things. In fact, I was watching a video from Elon Musk, and he said, what's the biggest challenge I've ever faced, was the question that he answered. He thought long and hard about it. And that's exactly kind of what he said. He said that it's difficult for me to get the truth in some areas because a lot of people think that I'm some creative genius. I'm just a normal guy like you and me, and I value the different perspectives. So if I'm wrong, I want to hear about it, and I want to understand what I'm missing, because that's going to make all of us stronger here. So, giving people an anonymous voice or a safe voice to share what they see and then challenge it, not necessarily get offended that we're being challenged. It's a good thing.
Yep. So next slides, I got a 5-step plan for planning your risk management journey. And so it starts with this one, or the one we were just on. Careful planning is the key to a risk management strategy. That we need to understand what our current state is and what our future state is and how we're going to get there. You're doing something for risk management today. It can be fly by the seat of your pants, reactive firefighting risk management, or it can be very mature and agile and structured. But where are you at today, the current state? And then what's the future state 2 or 3 years from now? What do you want it to look like? And then what needs to change, and how are you going to get to that place? The second piece is getting the right people on board. You need to make sure your team is ready, that they're prepared for the risk management journey. Who needs to be on this risk management team? Do we need more creative risk thinkers, because we have an overabundance of left brain risk thinkers? Do we need other departments and functions? Because right now our risk management strategy is like 80% focus on IT risks, and we're not bringing in enough ESG, environmental, social governance, and health and safety risks and things into this. Do we have a balanced team and approach? The third element is, do we have the right technology foundation to achieve this? And so we want to make sure we select the right equipment for the risk management journey, so that you don't just throw everything into a bag. You carefully select your equipment for the task at hand. You have a failed project when you start your risk management journey, and use the mountain climbing analogy. You find out you only have enough equipment to get you halfway up the mountain, and you got to go back down, start all over, but you're already absolutely exhausted because you just climbed up halfway, then had to go back and start all over. You need to make sure that you have the right technology foundation that can deliver on your future state. So you're not just restarting in the middle of your project because you selected the wrong technology. That happens all the time. I can think of a large pharmaceutical firm that I've worked with on their risk management strategy. And they selected the wrong technology, which I warned them about. And they came back to me and said, we either have to completely dumb down our program or go back to RFP. And the organization doesn't have an appetite for that. I can think of another firm that spent several years trying to implement a risk management solution and putting that in there, and they had 0 users on the platform because they selected the wrong technology, didn't meet their needs. You want to make sure you have the right agile technology that can deliver what you're trying to achieve. The next thing is to make sure you break things up into stages. If you're climbing Mount Everest, you don't just run up Mount Everest. If you just sprint up Mount Everest, guess what happens? You die. Your body actually has to get to that first base camp and actually has to acclimate to the altitude before your body is ready for the next level. And it has to acclimate to that altitude before it's ready for the next level. That's why it takes time to climb a big mountain like Mount Everest. Same thing with the big risk management strategy is you need to break things into stages. Finally, you need to prepare for changes because the journey is never over. That's what's exciting about our jobs. The last few years, it's been a pandemic, and we've had to be able to focus on resiliency during that. Now it's a tense geopolitical situation that impacts a lot of resiliency and agility for risk in our organizations and supply chains and operations in different parts of the world. Next year, who knows? The Earth can be destroyed by a Vogon constructor ship, making way for a hyperspace bypass for you Douglas Adams fans. But we don't know what's going to happen. It's a risky world out there. But even if it's not a big risk thing, the business has changed. There's a merger and acquisition, and we've got to bring in a new business into our risk management processes. That's what's exciting about our jobs is it's a very agile and changing world out there. It's a chaotic world. That means our jobs are always exciting, and we need to be ready for change. So finally, putting this together, we need agile risk management. We need to rethink risk management, build agile risk management. We're more aware of our risks and how they intersect and interconnect, but particularly how they impact performance and objectives of the organization. That means we can align and work together and be more responsive and addressing risks as they rise, because we're doing horizon scanning and seeing what's coming at the organization, which allows us then to be agile to navigate those risk obstacles or even use them to our advantage. But when risk does rear its ugly head, to be more resilient and recover quickly, and do so with information technology architecture that makes things more efficient in our use of human capital and financial capital resources.
Very good. I also think this outlines the process of how to approach and think about where we're at today and where do we want to go with our risk management. So it is about connecting that all the different voices from across the organization that have different perspectives that are valuable, especially those contrarians. I like to make sure that I have someone who disagrees with me at all times and just kind of check my thought process and make sure that we're on the same page. You never know what we might be missing. All right, very good. I think we have one more poll question before we switch gears into the Q&A section. So now that you've kind of understood the layout here and we've talked about maturity, we've talked about some of the different things that you could be measuring in your environment that'll indicate what your maturity is. Where do you think you are so far? Are you kind of in the planning stage, or are you making progress on your goals to integrate? Or are you someone who's fully integrated and you're kind of working on optimizing your position? That level 4 is really where you're at a better position to become more proactive in how you address risks in your environment. You have good detection and you have a process in place to discuss and come up with action items and make good decisions. All right, so just one more moment here on this poll question. We're still getting some answers in. Thanks everybody for participating in these polls. I think it gives some really good outputs and some insight actually for us as panelists. So thank you for this. All right, excellent. So we have kind of a quarter of the folks here are still kind of early in the process. They're in the planning stage, and hopefully what we discussed here today gets you thinking about what are some first steps to get started and what are some of the things that are going to be important in your organization. And then we also have about another half or so that are, we've definitely been working on, putting risk management as a priority, and we're making progress on our goals. So this is really good to see the maturity perspective here, the full spectrum.
Yep.
All right, thank you. So I think let's check the Q&A section here. We're talking about a model for recommending for frontline employee risk assessments. So I think the assessments is a good way to get input and give people a voice. So if we're doing the risk assessments at a periodic schedule, for me, my experience has been around organizing the different parts of the organization on a single platform. And at Kanini, we We do custom software development and product development. We also do data analytics and visualization. So it's getting that insight where you can make intelligent decisions. But I come from the ServiceNow practice. So I think ServiceNow is a really good example of a tool that their mission is to connect the different pieces and different processes into a workflow and then automate the pieces that can be automated. And it's extremely customizable. So you can almost do anything that you need. You can almost build anything that you need. But then that gets us into the question of, should we be building this in the tool? And some pretty exciting things that you can realize when you're connecting the dots, especially like that slide that we showed earlier. By the way, we're going to distribute the slides and the recording of this will be available. But when you're talking about the risks and the controls and the issues and the objectives, that kind of model that we showed in a previous slide, a good system that brings it all together and you can see the relationships between them. You can categorize each individual risk. And the important thing for me is that they change over time, or they can change over time. So just because something was a low risk, 4 months ago, what is the delta between now and now that we're looking at it again? So having the data there to show and get that insight around the change over time is extremely important. And my experience is helping customers expand their use of the ServiceNow platform and just bring it all together in the same place. I think that's extremely important.
Excellent insight.
Let's see. So what do you see as some common risk areas around business development discussions with the government? So what are some industry best practices to engaging with government to circumvent risk? So to me, I read that as a good opportunity for partnership. Michael, you work with government clients also, right? Do you have any insight on that?
Some. I used to work with a lot more back more in the IT security days, and I focused a lot on IT security. That's a big topic for government, is more IT security. But there's a lot of critical infrastructure questions and things like that come up with industry questions to government.
I think for me, there's always a next regulation. We have our recipe and our menu of regulations that we need to comply and show compliance today. But in the future, we need to be agile and have the ability to expand for ever increasing and changing regulations. You always know there's going to be more. Solution and a model for the use case. How can we let GRC in ServiceNow to be shared with multiple stakeholder groups within an organization? So for example, the controls from different stakeholder groups would want to be assessed slightly differently, and the controls should be segregated between different groups. Yes, and in fact, that's one of the core capabilities about the ServiceNow platform, is that by use of access control lists and business query rules, you can kind of focus on who has ability to read and also update different tables and even fields within a table. So when we're talking about controls, I used to do this at that fintech organization where I was only responsible for about 3 different controls out of the palette of maybe 50 on the entire audit. So I only saw my controls in our tool, and it was custom developed. That's some of the core capabilities that ServiceNow does in order to kind of keep it simple and bring that data to the larger audience for the people that are running the show. The best way to implement a security controls implementation ticketing system. So I laugh a little bit. When I hear ticketing system, I immediately think of how far we've come from just having a ticketing system for IT in the corner, right? It's all about connecting the dots across the organization on one single platform if we can. And it's about, again, awareness and just transparency, getting those controls and tying them to why they matter and tying them to the owner. Who is truly accountable in the organization for those controls and why do they matter, and kind of battle test them. So I think the attestations in ServiceNow do a really good job of kind of certifying that this control is relevant, and I know how to provide evidence in an audit environment. So what's the best way to implement a control system is one step at a time. What we do is assess your maturity and your priorities in your organization first. Like Michael mentioned earlier, it's about actually tying it to the business context. It's not just using technology for the sake of using technology, but getting it all in one place and letting the technology actually give us the data insights that we need to make better decisions. So in the current environment, we're seeing an increasing desire by senior leadership and the board to understand the alignment between their risks and their risk appetite. What are some effective ways you've seen to report this relationship and give a comfort or more complete understanding of how the organization is operating?
I
So
mean, to me,
Michael, yeah.
it's critically important to put things, understand what the objectives of the organization is, and to align risks to those objectives and defining risk appetite and tolerance levels around the risk related to those objectives.
Yeah, so it's tying it together into this risk register, and then what is our appetite for this category of risk, and how has that changed since we've talked about it before. Perfect. Well, I think we're almost out of time here. I just want to close out and invite everyone that has joined this webinar that if you contact us, everyone is eligible for a risk assessment. As we started talking about where are you now and where are you trying to go? We can definitely help you because that's our bread and butter here. And I think once you have a plan for your next steps, we could talk about maybe there's a technology solution out there that ties your business priorities together. Or if you're already using ServiceNow today, that's a great insight. If you're not using ServiceNow today from the technology perspective, how do you tie it all together? How do you connect the different departments across your organization? And how do you know where to get started? So that's part of that maturity assessment. You can scan this QR code on the screen for a link to our website to talk more about this topic. So again, thanks everyone for joining today. It was a lot of fun, Michael. I enjoy talking with you here about GRC and risk, and appreciate your time today.
Well, I appreciate being on the webinar with you.
All right, thanks everyone.